Sean here from SMP Designs, and today I'm going to be taking you through building the new bat cowl from my Etsy shop. We're going to be doing the one-piece version. We're going to start out, get your patterns printed out and assembled, and then once you get those cut out, you're going to cut your pieces out of headliner foam, and then you're going to back your facing fabric with the headliner foam, and some of my other tutorials cover that process. Starting out, we're going to begin with the neck. Assemble all of your pieces, make sure everything is marked. And I like to go in and pre-clip out these edges. And if you need help with where to clip them to, just follow the dotted seam allowance lines on the patterns. So you can see the front of the neck and the side are going to go together just like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line this up. And then I'm going to stitch that down to where I've made that clip. I'm going to put the needle down on the clip, and then I'm going to pivot the piece around and stitch the rest of that line. Now, to take some of the bulk out of this, I want to carefully peel back the headliner foam from the seam allowance on that side piece. And then I'm going to trim out just the foam. You don't want to cut the actual face fabric out of it because it'll weaken the seam. All you want to do is trim out the foam from that seam allowance to get rid of the bulk. Then lay that flat and give it a nice edge stitch right along that seam line. And then once you've got your seam done, go in and trim that excess seam allowance out. It makes it more comfortable to wear, and it also makes all the curves and the edges work better. Now we're just going to do the other side exactly the same way. Next, we're going to put the side back on. For that, we're going to line it up at the top. Ease the pieces together as we go down, and then just stitch it all the way to the bottom. And we're going to trim out that excess foam on the side back piece, and then give that a nice edge stitch and trim out the excess. And what you'll see is that when we're putting these pieces together, we're actually folding that seam allowance away from the side with the existing seam. And that way you're not sewing bulk over bulk, and it gives you a really nice shape. So next, we're going to be adding the upper part of the neck. And again, going to go in, clip those corners. And for this one, I'm going to start in the center front, at this very center front edge. And what this is going to do is, it's just going to make sure that everything stays in place and is right where it's supposed to be. So get that little center front locked down first, and it's going to make putting the rest of it together a lot easier. So I'm going to pivot out. I'm actually going to sew this on the other side so that I can sew up to my clip, because the angles go in opposite directions as you go around the back of the neck. Sew up to the clip, pivot, and come back around to the back. Now you're going to do the same thing for the other side. Sometimes it's going to be a little trickier because you have to start at the back and go towards the front. But as long as you just make sure to keep everything lined up, you won't have any trouble. Make sure you've got all your notches and your clips matched up. Pivot around and just stitch up until you meet up with that center front seam that you did before. And that's the upper part of the neck attached. Now you're going to take the foam out, the excess foam out of the upper part. Again, we're just peeling it away. And trimming it out. And then we'll do our edge stitch. And then cut that excess seam allowance out. When you're doing that, be very careful not to actually cut through your top stitching, or you'll have to go back and fix it. And here you can see what the neck and shoulders look like on our head form. Now we're going to start on the face. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to edge the eye holes. So I'm taking a thin spandex, black spandex, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew this to the outside of the eye hole at about 1/8 of an inch, because you want a really thin little binding. And I'm just going to very carefully go along the edges. At the corners, I'm going to put the needle down and I'm going to pivot it and stretch that spandex so that it goes around all the corners, which can be a little tricky, but if you go slow and carefully, you shouldn't have any problems. We're going to take the spandex and go all the way up the inside of the eye, all the way up to the bridge of the nose. Now I'm going to give a quick little snip on that spandex strip where it's going to go around the corners, because it's going to make it easier to roll it back. So just clip up to about 1/2 inch from your stitching line. And then you're going to do the same thing again, but you're going to very carefully roll that spandex underneath and stitch right up against it. Reach in from behind to pull it tight, and just very carefully and very slowly make your way all the way around that eye hole. All the while making sure that that spandex is nice and tight and you're getting an even edging all the way around. Then when you're done with that, you just go in and trim out that excess spandex. And there's one eye hole, nicely bound. Then you do the other one exactly the same way. And now it's time to put in the nose. So we're gonna sew up the sides of the nose first. And you're gonna notice the actual nose piece is gonna have a little bit of extra material at the top, which is gonna form the seam allowance to sew up the bridge of the nose under the eyebrow. So what you wanna do is make sure that the bottom edge of the face is matched up to the bottom edge of the nose. And then once again, we're gonna trim out that excess headliner foam. Hold that seam allowance back towards the nose piece, and then give it a little edge stitch, just to make sure everything stays nice and tight. Then you're going to take that extra little tab at the top of the nose and line it up with the bridge of the nose right under the eyebrows. This takes a little bit of easing because there are curves that are trying to work against each other. But again, if you just finger mold it and go slowly and carefully, you'll get it in there. And what's going to happen is that ease is going to create your little kind of scowl look at the eyebrows over the bridge of the nose. And then peel away that foam from the forehead side. Fold the bridge of the nose up toward the eyebrow. And then I like to give a little edge stitch across the top of the nose. And then you can see that little pucker there gives them kind of an angry look. Trim out your excess seam allowance, and there's your face put together, complete with scowl. Now we're going to work on the forehead. And what we want to do is make sure that we mark where the ears go. So you've got your triangle marks where the ears match up at the front of the forehead. Mark those on the back of your piece. And then get out your earpieces. So this is the inner ear piece. And the way it fits is it goes from the very back of the piece and matches up to that mark at the front. So match up your seam allowances. Start from that point that you marked. Ease the edges together and sew this all the way back to the back edge. And there's your inner ear attached. And we're going to take the excess foam out of the inner ear side and then trim out from that seam allowance. Do the other one exactly the same way, and there's your forehead with your ears on it. Now we're going to attach the sides of the head. And again, you see your triangle marks. Those are where your ears meet up. So you want to just give those a quick little dot on the back side to make sure you've got everything lined up where it's supposed to be. What you're going to do is you're going to line up your marks. You're going to sew from where you stopped that seam, attaching the inner ear, to about a 1/2 inch away from the front edge of the piece. Once you've got that sewn, you're going to flip the ear out. You're going to line up the back markings, and you're going to sew only the ear part up to the tip. Give it one step across so that you can get a good corner, and then stitch it down and exactly match up to those other seams. And then we want to peel the foam out from inside the ears. And when we're pulling the foam out of this one, we're actually going to do both sides. So all that excess foam out of the ears. Now we're going to clip across the tip of the ear, being careful not to cut through the seam. Trim that down really nicely so that you can get a good point when you turn that ear out. And the other side is going to go on exactly the same way. So what you're going to do, start from the front, line up your marks. You're going to start about a 1/2 inch back from the front edge, and you're just going to close up that little seam, stopping at the mark. The key here is you want all of these different seams to match up exactly, and that's going to give you a smooth transition from the forehead into the ear. Going up. Walk one step across the corner. If you walk one stitch across a corner, a tight corner like that, when you turn it out, it gives you a much nicer point. Now I'm just going into the seam allowance where the inner ear is attached to the forehead and just snipping that seam allowance. And what that'll do is it'll just allow the fabric in the seam allowance to spread out across the top of the head and make a nicer line. Be careful that you don't cut through the seam, and don't cut all the way up to the seam. We're going to go ahead and clip the corners. And now it's time to attach the face. We'll clip the little corners at the front of the face. And just like we did for the neck, we're gonna do the front, the very front first. Lock that center front down, and then it will make doing the sides easier. And I know that the back of the head has flipped up into the frame, so it's a little hard to see. But what I'm doing is just matching up that center front, and I'm just gonna stitch from clip to clip and lock down the front of the forehead. Now we're going to sew across the top of the eyebrows. So we want to turn this over, go from where you left off doing the center front, and then you're going to stitch up into that seam that we just did. Now remember, I told you to stop a 1/2 inch away from the edge, and this is why. So that that corner can pivot. So it's going to take some easing to get the eyebrow in here, but it will fit. Just go slow, finger mold it, use a little clips if you want to, or pins, but you got to ease that into that curve, and then sew right up to where that other seam ended. And there's that eyebrow seam. Now, just like we do all of our other corners, you're going to pivot. Make sure you have everything lined up nicely. And you're going to go from where that last seam ended as precisely as possible. Sew down to your clip. Drop the needle. Pivot the piece. And stitch it all the way up to the edge. And there's one half of the face attached. We're going to do the other side the same way, but again, it's going to go a little bit backwards, but that's all right, as long as you line up all your marks, line up all your seam lines that you need to hit, and take your time easing that eyebrow in. You should be fine. Mold that eyebrow. Coming from this direction, you're going to start at the bottom edge. But again, as long as you keep your marks lined up and your edges lined up, everything should fit together just right. Pivot that piece over and then stitch right up to where that last seam ended. And the face is attached, which is probably the fiddliest part of this project. Now what we're going to do is we're going to trim away the excess to the sides of the head and to the forehead, and then fold that seam allowance out towards the sides and up to the forehead, and then give our nice edge stitch all the way around that face. Trim out your excess seam allowance, and I cannot stress it enough, trimming out that excess seam allowance really helps all of your curves and all of your corners to become very sharp. Turn out your ears at this point. Use a point turner if it's helpful, but just be careful not to poke through. And the ears and the face are together. Now it's time to attach the face to the neck. Again, I'm going to go in and I'm going to clip my corners. And this connects from the tab on the side of the neck to the front edge of the face. You're going to start from that point, stitch to your mark and your clip, pivot, and sew all the way to the back. The excess foam on the seam allowance is going to come from the top side. Once you've got your excess foam trimmed out, you're going to give yourself a nice edge stitch all the way down. And once you get it put together, you've got your face opening complete. Now the face opening is going to be treated exactly the same way as the eyes. You're just going to take that spandex strip, you're going to do about 1/8 of an inch, Then you're gonna do some clips where the corners are. Roll it underneath, hold it tight, and then just sew it down all the way around. Once you're done, trim it out from the back. And here's what your bat cowl looks like at this point. Now it's time to assemble the back of the cowl. And we're gonna start by putting the zipper in. Now I'm using an invisible zipper here. You just wanna make sure that the zipper is longer than you actually want it to be when it's finished, because you're gonna trim it after you install it. So lay the zipper down at the bottom edge and then measure up how far you want it to go. And I'm just gonna take a small pin and mark that. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stitch together at the center back the two pieces up to that point that I just marked. And how long or short you want the zipper is completely up to you. I usually do them to about 12 to 14 inches. Now what I'm gonna do is use a cording foot or a zipper foot. And if you don't have one of these, I highly recommend you get one. It makes life a lot easier. And I'm gonna take my zipper, I'm gonna unzip it, I'm gonna match it up at the bottom edge, and then I'm just gonna stitch it all the way. And I'm gonna go all the way up, slightly farther than my mark. And then for the invisible zipper, I'm gonna go in and do another row of stitching where I'm stitching right up against the teeth. And that's what makes the invisible zipper invisible. There's our nice zipper sewn down. Now to do the other side, I'm gonna zip the whole thing up. I'm gonna start from my top edge, right where I left off. And I'm gonna sew down the other side, almost as if I were just sewing it together like it was a seam. Make sure the bottom edges match up. And that's what it looks like right now. So at this point, you have to unzip it all the way back up. And for the invisible zipper, you actually take the pull and you push it back through where you stitched. Then from the underside, you're gonna grab the pull and you're gonna unzip the zipper all the way up past your marks. And this allows you the freedom to do that second row of stitching on the other side. Then you're just going to take that pull from the back side and just very carefully pull the zipper until you come past your mark, and then you can zip the whole thing down. Now, you've got your excess at the top here. So what you're going to do is you're going to lay this down keeping it nice and straight, nice and flat, and at about 1/4 to 1/2 inch above where your zipper stops at the top, what you want to do is just go in there and put like a nice little bar tack. So you're going to do about 3 stitches backwards and forwards several times over the top of the teeth. And that's going to secure the top of the zipper. And then you can go in and trim out all of that excess from the top. Now I'm going to go back to my straight stitch foot. And I'm going to do some top stitching. Notice that I didn't bother to take the foam out because I'm spreading the pieces to either side, not both seam allowances in one direction. So the bulk isn't really going to be an issue on this one. The bulk is only really an issue when you're folding both sides of the seam allowance to the same side. And I'm going to trim that excess seam allowance out just at the top of the head, not where the zipper is. So when I'm trimming that out, I'm going to stop it where the zipper begins. And there's the center back of your cowl. Now it's time to attach the back pieces into the rest. I'm going to clip out those corners. And just like before, I'm going to start at the center front. Make sure I've locked down that center front edge. And then it'll make the rest of it a lot easier. With the center front done, it's time to sew the side back seams in. Now this is a long line of stitching, and it's going to take some molding. So if you need to use little clips or you need to use pins, do whatever works best for you. When you get to the side back where the ears are, you want to stitch over that ear seam with the seam allowances pointing upwards. I know it's hard to see here, but just keep the seam allowances folded up. And then just mold the back of the head, lining up marks. And lining up your bottom edge. And then do the other side. Trim out all that excess foam, and then fold all of your seam allowances towards the back, and then go in and do your last round of edge stitching. Then go all the way around it again and trim out all that excess seam allowance. Now it's time to finish up your cowl. We're going to finish off that bottom edge the same way we did the eye holes and the face. So I've got my spandex strip. And I'm just going to go all the way around that bottom edge at about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. The bottom edge can be a little bit of a wider edge if you want it to be, because it doesn't have quite as many small corners and angles to go around. So do it at 1/4 of an inch if it's easier. When you're doing this edge, you need to leave some excess at either end, because what you're going to do is fold it over to create a nice finished corner. Then roll all that spandex to the back, and just like you did before, stitch right up against it. Just go slowly, make sure that you're keeping all of your edges nice and clean, and keeping it pulled tight to the back. When you get to the end, fold it under, wrap it to the back. And then carefully trim all that excess out. Then turn the whole thing right side out. And congratulations, you have just finished your one-piece bat cowl. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have fun creating this piece and suiting up. For more information, other videos, walkthroughs, and tutorials, visit SMP Designs, and I'll see you next time.